This is the Court Leader's Advantage, a podcast series for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net and in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. One of the major challenges facing state trial courts today is the disturbing lack of accurate national statistical data. Beneath the surface of our justice system lies a troubling truth. We often don't know, we can't know what's really happening. How many cases do our courts handle? What kinds? And how efficiently? Without reliable data, we're left to making educated guesses in the dark. This absence of clarity is not accidental. It's the result of a decentralized system of justice. Some of the results include lack of uniform court coding. What one court calls a hearing, another might call a conference. These differences seem small, but they add up to a patchwork of mismatched codes, formats, and definitions across jurisdictions. Limited data transparency and public access. Even when data exists, it often is locked behind arcane systems, hard to find and harder still to interpret. For those outside the court system, understanding what's really going on can feel like deciphering a secret language. Hurdles with data sharing, disconnected technologies, legacy systems, and inconsistent standards create silos of information, making collaboration truly a challenge. Inability to measure performance and outcomes. Without standardized metrics, we can't track how long cases take, how they are resolved, or whether justice is truly being served. It's like trying to navigate with a map that constantly changes shape. Enter the National Open Court Data Standards Project, NODS, a collaborative effort led by the National Center for State Courts, the Conference of State Court Administrators, and the Joint Technology Committee. Its mission is ambitious: bring order to the chaos. By creating shared standards for collecting, sharing, and interpreting court data, NODS aims to shine light in the shadows, allowing courts to operate with greater transparency, efficiency, and consistency. I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This month, we're venturing into the world of NODS, the National Open Court Data Standards Project. We'll explore how this effort will transform access to court data for researchers, policymakers, the media, and the public. Joining me today to discuss these issues are the Honorable W. Brent Powell, Judge of the Missouri Supreme Court, T.J. Bement, Court Administrator for the 10th Judicial District in Athens, Georgia, and Laura Rittenauer, Case Management Specialist for the Administrative Office of the Courts in Phoenix, Arizona. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. Give us an overview of NODS. What is the National Open Court Data Standards Project? How did it originate? And what challenges is it designed to address? TJ?
This is kind of a big question, so I'll kind of unpack it pretty generally. This was a project initiated by the National Center for State Courts a number of years ago that spawned out originally from their court statistics project. And let me liken it this way. You collect court data at the local level that may go up to a circuit or a district that then goes up to the state level. And eventually some of that data goes up to the national level. But what makes it up to the national level is what we call aggregate of aggregates. Really, there's just very general case information of number of civil cases, number of criminal cases. And you can't get much granular than that because that's where the inconsistency starts. So I remember the conversation with the folks at the National Center several years ago, really talking about how do we get to the next level of court data? And a lot of conversation then ensued. They brought together some experts from around the country, folks like Laura, and others that were in administrative office of the courts. They brought in some judges. They brought in representatives from major case management systems, the information providers that manage our court systems, and nonprofits and academics, and all had a conversation of how do we get to that next level of granular court data. And what ultimately everybody came to was this idea of everybody speaks different languages at their court level data. What we need to do is not convince people to change their local practice, but find a way for local practice to communicate more globally. So they likened it to sort of a Rosetta Stone. I could be speaking Greek, you Pete could be speaking Latin. We should be able to communicate if we both understood some third language. So enter the conversation about nods. We both agree to translate our information into a third-party language. And that's really where nods came in to say, what happened? They said, let's agree to this. And they got together a group of experts across multiple case types. And what they did is they mapped out the life of a case, from time of filing to time of disposition. What are the major life events? And they defined those both in terms of what is that data element? What is that data element comprised of? Is it a number? Is it text? Is it a date, etc.? And then came up with that list. The goal being to establish that list of standards that I might call a hearing, and you could call it a conference, Pete. But we both agree that when we're going to communicate with this third party, we're going to use their language for what they call this type of event. So that conversation went on for a number of years. And then I'll circle back in a bit to tell you about where this moves to a standard from the Joint Technology Committee perspective.
Laura?
For here in Arizona, we have 10 different case management systems. And so we use nods as a framework for having discussions about those case management systems, what each case management system should have, and what data should be transmitted to the AOC. And for us, it's really about that accurate, consistent, and especially timely data reporting that we're hoping to provide not only to court leadership, but also to funding authorities and the media and the public as well.
Now it appears that NOD solves more problems for the state's administrative office than for the state's trial courts. Am I wrong in that perception? Are there incentives to encourage trial courts to adopt NODs? Judge Powell?
Well, Pete, first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm a bit of a data geek and excited to chat about nods with you and your viewers. Some quick background, though, and I'll move to answering your question, but some quick background on Missouri. We have a statewide case management system that all courts, trial courts and municipal courts, all are required to utilize. So our data standards are very uniform across the state. And last year, we began the process of implementing nods into our case management system, and we just finished the process of comparing the data that we're currently collecting to the data that nods recommends and the standards set forth there. And based on this review, we are now in the process, or we have, or are in the process of changing our case management system to reflect these data standards that we determined we should be collecting as part of our review and implementation of nods. So yes, I do think nods is something that a state judicial administrative office would find very, very useful and should definitely explore to improve the data that their courts are collecting. But I also think that state trial courts could benefit from nods as well, especially if the trial court has a case management system that's independent from the case management system of other courts in the state. Now, I know before I came to the Missouri Supreme Court, I was a former trial judge, and I know that trial courts are more focused on their cases and their caseloads and do not always have the luxury of thinking about case data they are collecting. But I think, in fairness, trial courts, more than any entity, have more to benefit from implementing nods than any other entity. And a few anecdotes to support this view. I would point to criminal pretrial release, right? In order to determine whether or not you have a meaningful pretrial processes, you need to analyze your court data, and you need to have a thoughtful conversation and a thoughtful review of the data you're collecting in that area so that you can hopefully measure your successes and also measure your deficiencies to hopefully improve the processes that you may take in the realm of criminal pretrial. I also think, for example, sentencing, and that it's staying focused on criminal. I think sentencing is another area where you can really study your disparities in your sentences across the state and across different maybe divisions within your specific trial court. So I think trial courts more than anyone have a lot to benefit from going through the process of implementing NODs.
Laura?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, here in Arizona, we have 10 case management systems. One is a state-sponsored, and the other 9 are non-state sponsored. And there's been issues in the past with data collection when leadership needs data across the state for a particular project or initiative. Or again, there's been requests from the legislature, et cetera. And so, here in Arizona in 2020, we took the NODS framework and we customized it. Here in Arizona, we call them required data elements, or RDEs. And in Arizona, courts must participate in the RDE project. It's required by an Arizona Code of Judicial Administration. And then the courts must transmit the standardized data, and that's required by a Chief Justice administrative order and an administrative directive from our executive director as well. And so, the hope is that getting all of that data from case initiation through to wherever the case is in its life cycle is going to help the AOC with reporting. But also, one of our goals is to take some of that records request and statistical reporting burden off of all of those courts. If we have all of the data, then we can create here at the AOC the reports that are needed for different data processes and statistical reporting. And the hope, again, is that then it's not, every month courts have to be sending in data. We will already have it for them.
Now, Chip and Dan Heath, in their book Made to Stick, wrote, "One good story can level a mountain of statistics." I suspect many line staff may view the adoption of NODS coding requirements as a lot of extra work for the sake of generating statistical reports. Judge Powell, what challenges did Missouri face in implementing NODS?
Yes, there are definitely some challenges, and there was some pushback, especially at first. We in Missouri, we got interested in the NODS initiative when our court began working with a local university studying disparities in our court system. And what we learned during this study is that we were not really collecting much data related to race, ethnicity, and gender. And it's hard to study and improve disparities in our judicial process if we're not collecting the data. So we learned about the NODS initiative through the National Center for State Courts, and we said, wait, we got to do this. This is great. Why have we done this before? But your suspicions are correct. There are challenges, right? We have a lot of great people working in our court system here in Missouri. And when we sprung NODS on them, they were like, wait a minute, we're doing all these other important projects, all these other priorities. We don't have time to do this. But I think what it's important to know about NODS is it's not a solution to a case management problem. It's not a solution to an IT issue, and it's not even a solution to data collection. Rather, it's a process. At least that's our experience in Missouri. And it's an opportunity to engage in a mapping exercise. And what I mean by this is that NODS provides us with a roadmap to map and study what data our courts are currently collecting, and to think about the data we are collecting and ask, why are we collecting this data? Is this data important? What data what data are we not collecting, and would we benefit from collecting that data? And so essentially what we did is we went through, there's approximately 400 data elements that are associated with NODS, data standards that NODS recommends. And we went through those 400 data elements and we compared these elements to the data elements that we were collecting. And we asked, so why, if we weren't collecting a data element that NODS suggested, we'd ask, why are we not collecting it? And would we benefit if we started to collect that data? And we asked experts in the various areas of our justice system: criminal, civil, domestic, juvenile, probate, traffic. And we asked them, would you benefit if we collected this data? And so while we initially had some pushback from staff who were kind of reluctant to kind of start another big project, once it became clear it wasn't necessarily a project to complete, a box to check off, but a chance to actually engage in a thoughtful review and mapping exercise to reflect on the data that we are collecting, we got a lot more buy-in.
TJ, do you have any real world examples where decision makers truly benefited from improved data, especially if it was a direct result of nods?
Pete, you introduced at the end there the right statement. Do you have the story? And I think that's really where nods helps. We are great, I think, storytellers in the court system about the good things that we do, as well as the bad things that we see, and everything in between. But what we often lack is good data to be able to support and provide that greater context for the story. So here's kind of our story. We're pretty early in Georgia and the NODS adoption. So we took the NODS list from the National Center for State Courts, and we've shopped that around. We went and talked with our prosecutors, our public defenders, all our different commissions: Commission on Dispute Resolution, Commission on Domestic Violence, our Department of Corrections, our Department of Community Supervision, our state criminal information system, as well as clerks representing all our different classes of courts, and had conversations with them about, look at this data set from NODS and tell us which ones you're already collecting those things, and tell us what's not. So we're kind of creating our own version of NODS, still staying true to the NODS, knowing that not every state is going to adopt all 100 NODS elements, whatever number there is, but you may adopt 75 of them as an example. So we're going through that process, and kind of our learning example has been the work that we've done with our accountability courts in the state. We call them accountability courts. That's our drug courts, mental health courts, veteran courts, et cetera. We've got about 180 different programs across the state right now serving Georgians in battling their mental health issues and addressing their addiction and drug and alcohol abuse, et cetera. And what our state did a number of years ago was provided a free case management system. So they could choose from one of two systems. But what we quickly found out is that everyone started using those systems differently. They saw it as a thing. I'm going to start recording all the things that happen in the life of these programs on these cases, but they started doing it differently, just with two systems. And we realized that if we're going to tell the story of bringing people back from addiction and addressing people's mental health situations, we needed not only the story, but we needed the data to support that. So it was a multi-year process working and coming up with data standards independent of those two case management systems, basically a NODS for those universe of cases, for accountability court cases. Adopted that list of data standards, and it has continued to evolve over the last couple of years. Then worked with those case management system providers to make sure they could transmit data to then match those different data fields in those data standards. So fast forward a couple of years, I think we've got one of the most robust accountability court systems in the country because we got great data. We're able to share that data with our legislators at the state level to the point where our state is giving us $30+ million a year to support these programs at the state level. When I started 15 years ago, the state gave us $1.5 million. So we've increased 30-fold in 12 years. But more importantly, we're able to have good peer reviews. We're able to have good analysis. We're able to work with academics and researchers. We were able to use that data that came from the NODS version, the harmonization of that data at the granular level, and work with a research group and the University of Georgia and do a statewide economic analysis to see what the benefit and show the actual dollar savings. For every dollar that gets invested, X number of dollars comes in return on that investment of not using emergency rooms, not using public benefits, all these kind of things that come from people being clean and sober and healthy in our communities. And so that's where we're able to turn the story and back it up with the hard data to show and contextualize the work that we do in those programs.
In Missouri, for example, that's exactly what we're hoping to glean from and benefit from NODS. Is we're trying to roll out a new statewide pretrial program, right? But our legislature, before they want to fund this, they want to know, is this working? Is this, is this actually saving us money on the back end on DOC and our local jails? And so we just don't have the data to support that yet. But now that we've started to analyze the data we are collecting in this area after our review and our process of mapping through the NODS process, we're very hopeful that we're going to be able to have that data in the next few years or so to help support our request with the legislature.
Yeah. And I would just like to add that here in Arizona, there was standardization that was happening at the Superior Court level, but not really at the limited jurisdiction court level. And when we started our data standardization advisory committee, which has representatives from all of our different case management systems, and we talked about required data elements, the need to standardize the data that is transmitted to the AOC. It's kind of changed the culture as well, having those monthly meetings and having consistent participation to talk through some of the new projects that instead of standardizing once it's time to give a report to the funding authority and trying to kind of normalize the data, standardizing things from the get-go. In the past year here in Arizona, they've implemented an inmate release court. And as that program was starting to get rolled out, we met with the staff that are working on implementing this statewide and said, what data do you need? Both just general data for the program, and met with them. Then they met with the standardization advisory committee. It took several months, but now all courts in the next year will start transmitting the same event codes, the same calendar events, et cetera. And we just feel like that is going to help so much more when it comes to, as they're mentioning, funding authorities wanting to know what's happening, what is the story, and is this impacting things in a positive way? So I think here in Arizona, it's changing the culture and working more together. Because in Arizona, the case management systems don't have to adopt the statewide standards in each particular nod, in each data element. They just need to transmit it. And so that's how we set things up, kind of talking about what TJ said. We've got 9 different languages here, but when people send things to the AOC, they're transmitting in that required data element code that we can then aggregate and look at things more statewide.
Now, what is the current status of state courts adopting NODS? And what incentives or support does NODS offer to encourage broader implementation? Judge Powell?
The National Center for State Courts was very helpful in implementing NODS in Missouri. They were there with every step of the way for us. It started with a presentation and overview of NODS to stakeholders that we pulled together from various different subject matters in our judicial system. Then after we put this group of experts together, the National Center, Diane Robinson specifically, helped us lead monthly convenings as we went through and kind of mapped the data elements that we were tracking in Missouri and comparing them and analyzing whether we should be collecting data as recommended by NODS. And I can honestly say, I don't know what other states are doing necessarily. Sounds like there's a lot of activity across the United States, but I can tell you there's a lot of support from the National Center if someone decided to implement NODS.
Laura?
Here in Arizona, when I came to this position, I was immediately invited to a quarterly meeting that the National Center for State Courts coordinates. And there's about 15 different states that are now invited to those quarterly meetings. And they're very helpful because, as the judge mentioned, you got the National Center for State Court staff kind of talk about what's happening with the NOD steering committee, various things that might be coming down the road. But then each court or each state gets to share kind of their challenges and their successes. And I found those calls very, very helpful because if there is a state that is doing something that, Arizona might benefit for, then I have a contact to reach out to, as well as in the past month, Diane Robinson reached out to me and said, hey, can you help this particular state? Can you send them some documentation about what Arizona is doing? And so I think those calls are very helpful so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to nods or feel like, oh, there's 400 nods. We have to implement all of these. This is a huge project. Let's not even start. You can hear from a state that's just taking like 30 of them for a very, very specific project. And so that's helpful to hear as well as, the National Center for State Courts. They assist by answering specific questions via email between the quarterly meetings. And also, I just think there's a lot of really great resources on the NODS website at the National Center for State Courts as well.
Now, what advice do you have for states that are contemplating adopting nods? TJ?
So, coming from someone at the local level, it's kind of three things. It's one, good communication. So having a good plan in the front end and then communicating that to your stakeholders in the state. And that includes your clerks, your court staff, your judges, and your justice partners, especially if your prosecutors or public defenders or community supervision or corrections and stuff are in different branches or have different, command structures and whatnot, communicating and getting everybody on the same page as to what the plan is going to be. Second, start small. When you look at the NOD spreadsheet that comes from the National Center, it can be pretty gosh darn intimidating. It's a spreadsheet with lots of, minute level data that can be really, esoteric for some people. But when you get the right people in the room and start having a conversation and say, hey, where can we quickly agree that we can talk on it? And it's usually information on the front end. It's filing information, the basics of how a case gets initiated. The life of the case may differ a little bit, but then on the tail end, how you close out a case is going to be pretty uniform no matter where you are. So look for those common elements and start as small as you can. And then in your plan, be thinking about how can we come back and expand out this list and document that. And then lastly, I think it's the adage of, what's in it for me? What can you convince folks to do to participate? And sometimes it's funding. Sometimes it's getting courts up to a new case management system that's going to work really well with NODS, because a lot of the case management system vendors out there are already aligning themselves on the back end to be able to communicate to NODS. Or it may be as simple as, an individual clerk has an annual caseload reporting requirement. And if you can get that court to adopt a NOD standards, being able to do that annual report becomes a push of a button.
Laura?
To echo what some of TJ said, go out to the NODS website, look at the different resources that are there, and then I would reach out to the National Center for State Court staff that coordinate NODS and ask them to get you in touch with other states. And so that you can kind of meet other people that are already in the trenches, have learned some lessons. They might be able to help you with some shortcuts and avoiding a path that you were thinking about going down. And when it comes to the resources, there's the spreadsheets, there's the mapping information, but also there's recently been for the National Center for State Courts some data dive webinars that they've done, and I got to participate on one last fall with Illinois, representing Arizona, as well as staff from Illinois and Puerto Rico. And it was really interesting, again, to see how each of us are implementing or using the NODS framework in a different way, but it's all towards the same goal, creating consistently accurate data for court leadership and for the public.
Judge Powell?
Well, as the iconic sports apparel company would say, just do it. That's what my recommendation would be. I highly recommend. I don't want to repeat what Laura and TJ has already said, but I think one of the things I'd recommend is that come in with the right process or the right frame of mind, I should say. This is not, this isn't, hey, we're going to implement this. Hey, IT department just, incorporate this into our case management system. No, this is a thoughtful examination of the data that your court is collecting and the data that maybe you should be collecting, and think about why you're doing it and why you're not doing it, right? And so I think there's a lot of value with nods as far as breaking down silos, and so we can have court data that can be shared and used both nationally, statewide. That's all well and good, but where I think there's a lot of value to implementing nods is what you get out of it, right? Again, it's very difficult to try to improve or analyze or study your judicial processes unless you have good data. And so if you have any interest in trying to improve the way that you administer justice in your courts, you need good data to do that. And nods is a great place, a great starting place to begin that analysis and that work.
A heartfelt thank you to Judge Powell, TJ, and Laura for sharing their insights, expertise, and vision for the future of the NODS project. As we've seen, open data standards are a crucial element in building an efficient, effective court system that the public can trust. And to you dedicated court professionals tuning in today, your continued commitment to fostering public trust and confidence in our courts is essential to the strength and integrity of our justice system. Thank you. Join us on Tuesday, August 19th, for another episode where we dive into the issues facing courts today. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast series on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, on the Court Leader website, on YouTube, Facebook, iTunes, LinkedIn, and on Instagram. Did you enjoy this episode? Please share the podcast link on your social media pages. Every share helps spread the word about the vital work court administrators do to strengthen justice in our communities. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, at nacomnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to review, but you don't want to search the entire episode to find it? The additional resources section of the webpage has a complete transcript of today's episode with the time markers for when each question was asked. Find the discussion question on the transcript, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can either review the comments on the transcript or listen to the panelist's comment on the audio or video recordings. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leaders website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.